So let's talk a little bit more about banding, specifically fixed versus sliding banding. I think this example might make it a little bit clearer because it's not just where the start point is and how fixed the bands are, it's also a bit about how we select from the bands. So as I previously stated, when we talk about a fixed band, we have the bands created by basically the standard error of the measurement or whatever particular metric we're using to create a band of people within the same error zone. So for example, we might have our highest band is band 9, and that exists with scores 98, 97, 95, 95, and 94. And then our next band starts up with 91 through 81, next band, etc. So we can kind of see this concept. And again, bands may be based on the standard error of the measurement. They could also be based on stay 9 scores. So we could have raw scores from 0 to 100, but we also have people that fall in the first 10th percentile, the second 20th percentile, etc. So there's a lot of different ways to create the bands. But once the bands are created, whether they're fixed or sliding depends on basically whether they're fixed, but also how we select. So if we're using a fixed system, we anchor the first band regardless of how we actually determine what that band is. Again, standard error, standard deviation, or potentially percentage of applicants. At that point, we would have to treat everyone within that band equally, but we would not move down to the second band until all people had been selected out of that first band. So we are making a distinction. We are making a decision that this band, the top band, is higher level applicants on average than the next band. And therefore the bands don't move. So if I selected the applicant with a score of 98, and next I selected the one with a 94, and the next I selected the one with a 95, at that point I can't move down to the next band yet because there are still people that are quantitatively, by the system of selection, better than the people in band 2. So I'd also have to select the person that had the second 95 score and the person with the 97 score before I could ever start considering people from the second band. Again, once I move down to that second band, I should treat all applicants equally, whatever their score is, anything from a 91 to an 81. But again, I couldn't go down to the third band until everyone was selected from the second band. When we look at sliding, not only is the banding specifically tied to the top score a little bit more, it also will slide as we select people. So let's say again, we start with a sliding band. It looks the same before we make any selection decisions. And if I select the person with the 94 out of the first band as my first applicant, nothing changes. But if I select the person at the top, the 98, that is the top score that is anchoring that band. And as I select that person out, I slide the band. And what that sliding means is that as I move forward, actually, I see my animations are actually back on fixed right now. So again, in fixed, I have to select everyone out of band 1 before I can ever select someone out of band 2. But in sliding, when I select that top score of 98, the band moves down. So now the top score in the first band is a 97, which also means I've just pulled someone from band 2 into band 1. Now again, if I select someone that is not at the top of the band, it doesn't cause the band to slide. But anytime a top applicant is selected, the band slides. So it's a little bit more of a free-flowing system, and each time you select someone, you change who's in each of the bands. Okay. Let's talk about writing multiple choice tests. So we're going to get a little bit into test theory here and how to write good test questions. So this is kind of psychometrics in a box, short lecture on some of the things we want to consider. And again, this is my purpose in these lectures is to give you enough basis to where you have enough knowledge to get more information if you ever need to do these things, but also to be a better consumer of white papers and information about tests. So when you're being asked to evaluate multiple choice tests, which are fairly common in selection, especially when the key things we're trying to measure are knowledge or skills, you have a very good basis of what you should know to be able to determine if a test has gone through the proper rigor. So generally speaking, Bloom's taxonomy 1956 is basically about what can we test with multiple choice test or written test questions. And they include knowledge, recalls facts and information; comprehension, demonstrates an understanding of facts and terminology; application, can use information in concrete situations; analysis, can break materials down into parts, identifying both the parts and the relationship to each other; synthesis, can put the parts back together to produce a unique entity, generate a plan, or derive new relationships; and evaluation, can use evidence and support to judge the value of a thing for a given purpose. So as we look at this list, that's one of the first things we want to consider when we're creating any kind of employment test is, again, based on the job analysis, what are we after? Are we after comprehension? Are we after knowledge? Are we after analysis? Are we after application? And again, let's think about the definition of these. Application, can use information in concrete situations. So that basically isn't just asking if someone knows what a hinged flange is. That would be a knowledge or maybe a comprehension. Do you recognize which of these devices or which of these pictures is a hinged flange? However, application, what would you use a hinged flange for, might be a question where a problem is produced where the hinged flange is the best solution for that problem. That might be an application. Analysis may simply be giving someone a series of parts or a series of relationships to each other and asking them to figure out what is most likely wrong with the situation. Now, some of these obviously would make more sense in an actual job, or basically a job situation where we're actually asking people to do the job or to use simulations. But we can try to get at least close, some psychological reality or psychological fidelity, by creating carefully crafted questions. And the next time you actually take any kind of multiple choice test or even look at one, ask yourself what the questions are. And you will definitely see that there are some questions that are just asking you to recall facts. Which word goes into this slot? Some of them are asking you to demonstrate an understanding of those words. Some of them are asking you to apply those words. But others are a little more complex. Those longer word questions often are asking for analysis, synthesis, or evaluation. So once you think about the various things that you can try to test with questions, the next thing you want to do when you're actually creating a test is determine how much of each you need. So again, we might, for example, create a matrix. What are we actually trying to measure from the job analysis? So for example, if I'm trying to create a test that is meant to measure knowledge of psychology, I might want to decide, well, I want to make sure I capture some research methods. I want to get at least a little bit into physiological psychology, but for the most part, what I'm really interested in is sensation and perception from the cognitive. So if that's what I'm testing, it's a good idea to throw those constructs down. What does this class cover? So this is an example probably of a sensation perception class. Primarily about half the test should be on sensation and perception. Some of it might be on the physiological aspects of sensation and perception, kind of the medical or biological issues, but also a little bit on the research methods that we use to study sensation and perception. Once I have that, I want to start thinking about, for each one of these categories, what questions are knowledge, comprehension, and application. Now again, this matrix could become much more complex. I might be trying to measure several aspects from a job analysis or several aspects from a class, and I might be using more than 3 of the taxonomy we just talked about as far as the questions I want to ask. So I want to find out, what am I actually trying to measure? And again, this is just a way to systematically make sure that the test we're making covers what we're actually interested in capturing, specifically if we're doing selection. So once we start creating multiple choice questions, and the reason we usually go with multiple choice questions in these situations is eventual speed and ease. So it takes more time to create a good multiple choice question than it does a fill in the blank or short answer question. So short answer questions, fill in the blank questions, are easier to write. However, they take more time and they take often a subjective judgment to actually score. A good multiple choice question takes longer to create, but once it is created, it is easy to score and easy to interpret, and it's more objective. Now, the question itself may still be subjective, but the answer is yes, no. One of the questions has been deemed right, the others have been deemed wrong. So when we're talking about a multiple choice question, we want to think about the question, that's the stem, what is the actual question, and then the responses. And we need to think of both the correct response and any incorrect responses, distractors or foils. And again, we have to ask, what is the purpose of the question? If the question is fairly straightforward and we just seriously need to know, does the person know the answer, we generally want just incorrect responses. If we're actually trying to get at a question that is a little more nuanced, we have to be very careful how we create foils or distractor items that are basically conceivably correct if you don't have the full knowledge necessary to understand the completeness of the question. We also want to ask, how difficult should the question be? How much discrimination are we looking for in these questions? Now, some of this we've already covered in some of the other lectures as far as question design and kind of classical test theory and item response theory, that we're wanting to think about what is the difficulty level. Even when we were talking about the Enghoff method earlier in class, we were also talking about experts judging how difficult is the question for a new applicant. All of these things we need to be considering as we're creating test items. So again, questions. If they're measured at knowledge, we want to avoid questions about personal opinions. We want to avoid obscuring details. So questions need to be direct and easily understood. So if you're not interested in capturing vocabulary or detailed understanding of complex words, don't use them. We want to make sure that the questions are as clear as possible, and we also want to make sure that they are something that is both logically, but also beyond logically, legally, clearly attached to the job and has a right or wrong answer. So we generally want to avoid any questions that get into "it depends" answers or personal opinions. We want to make sure the question sim itself avoids obscure details. Now, we may want obscure details in those the responses, the foils or the distractor items, but the question itself should be very clear. It should be clear and simple with concise language. We should avoid slang, obsolete wording, abbreviations. You also want to make sure you're not using any words that may not be relevant very quickly. So again, that's slang, but a lot of times we do want to analyze the language we're using for words that weren't necessarily in vogue a couple years ago, because those are generally words that aren't probably going to be in vogue in a couple years later. We want to make sure that they are politically correct, non-sexist, very ethnic names. And politically correct here really isn't about being politically correct. It's about making sure that the questions themselves don't have sexist or racist overtones to them. And that's something that's sometimes a little hard to do. We really want to ask ourselves, would this question be read the same way and interpreted the same way by different people from different backgrounds and different experiences? So a lot of times one of the examples of this that kind of crept into almost all testing was a lot of testing tries to make the questions a little bit more friendly by making them personal examples, and there's no problem with that. But a lot of tests, the personal examples were, for the most part, white male names. Chad did a lot of stuff on tests for a while. So if you're going to use names, you want to vary them. One of the things I often will do is I actually often change the names on the tests to reflect specifically the diversity in the organization that I'm currently working in. So I'll actually look at a current employee list and draw names from there to use as my example names. So that's just one way you can kind of make sure that you're doing this. You want to make sure that the test represents the sample or populations that you're actually testing. You also should make the questions independent, and this is another thing that's sometimes a little bit hard as we develop an entire test. We want to make sure that missing one question should not lead to answering other questions incorrectly. In other words, if I am confident that I am right on one question, is there now 3 other questions that are getting at the same issue that I would then miss as well? This is going to inflate my lack of knowledge of this one item. The only time this might be appropriate is if you are actually testing a very key concept that someone has to know to be able to do the job. Then you might be able to make the argument that you wanted to weight the test to where if you didn't know this thing, you would miss multiple items. But you want to make sure that you're not doing this with no purpose, that just by the way you wrote the questions. And this is hard to do. I often catch this in tests that I've already checked multiple times, and I'll actually, as I'm grading it 5 tests in, notice that there's a question that if you miss, it would imply the answer to multiple questions later on in the test. So we want to avoid those as well. So there's 3 kinds of question formats, and we're going to talk about different ways. One of them is simply an incomplete sentence. So for example, the 3 types of value are, and then the answer stems. The answers to the stem are those possible answers. A direct question, what are the 3 types of value? Or an embedded blank, use esteem and blank. Use, esteem, and blank are the 3 types of value. So again, just different ways, and it's not a bad idea to vary these simply to make the test a little bit more entertaining and engaging. Generally speaking, we do find if you use the exact same type of question format every single time, you do see less engagement and motivation declines as someone takes the test. They start to become a little sloppy in how they read, as they basically, you have primed a framework in their head that all the questions are going to be this way, and they start to get lazy. If you change out the formats, people tend to read the questions a little more carefully each time, tend to be more engaged in the test. Questions should define one clear central problem completely. The question should be meaningful without referring to the alternatives. It should be complete enough that it can be answered as a short answer question, and that's probably the easiest thing to test. Whenever you create a multiple choice question, you should be able to answer it if you truly knew it without the choices available. If you have to see the choices to understand the question, that's not a very good question. Basically, that means that part of the question has become part of the answer. It should lead to conceptually similar alternatives, including a directing verb. So again, we usually want a verb in there, and also it should be something that we could write in different ways. In other words, if you create a question that could only be worded in one particular way, there's no other way to write it, take another look at that question. That usually is going to be a little too specific, or that question is worded again to where it's not complete without the answer. You want to include as much of the wording in the question as possible. So you want to make the answers as short as you can while still retaining what you're testing for. Avoid repeating the same material in each of the alternatives. So if you notice that your actual alternatives, your answers, all have 2 or 3 words at the start, those should have been in the question. Alternatives should always be short as possible. Decrease the time needed to read the question. May need to rewrite questions and alternatives to do this. Again, these are things we want to check for either when we're writing questions, but also when we're evaluating the quality of a test that we may be using. You want to avoid negative phrasing if at all possible. State the item in the positive form whenever possible. Positively worded items tend to measure more important objectives than negatively worded items. Anytime you use a negatively worded item, you are going to run into some people getting stuck on the verbs and words themselves, leading to you potentially not capturing their true score. So use negative phrasing only when the wrong procedure or wrong information can result in serious adverse consequences. In other words, the only time we should use a negative phrased question in a multiple choice test is if that is specifically what we're measuring for. We're measuring for their knowledge of a negative, and that negative should have consequences that would be job relevant. Again, the main reason for this is that when we create a negatively worded question, it is cognitively more difficult to understand, which means that people who actually may have the right answer, their true score would be getting this item correctly, may miss it just because it's negatively worded. So we want to avoid this because it creates basically error in our measurement, unless, again, it is absolutely necessary to measure their understanding of a negative situation. So let's talk a little bit more about the guideline for writing these alternatives. And again, this isn't the questions themselves, these are the response options. So how many alternatives are needed? 4 alternatives are generally what has been found to work the best, and it's what we see most often. The reason for this is basically best practices and a little bit of science. So generally speaking, again, what we're wanting to think about is the more answers that we have, the harder it becomes to write those alternatives. So we write the question, we make sure that it's a solid question, we write the first alternative, which is the correct answer. At that point, we now need to start creating distractors. These need to be items that are reasonable, they're not just ridiculous, but are wrong enough that we can distinguish between the correct answer and the incorrect answer. This is the difficult part of writing a multiple choice test, coming up with adequate distractors that potentially could result in someone that's just guessing or is just trying to figure out the question without the knowledge to choose one of those distractors without them becoming too close to the actual correct answer or too far away that no one would select them. The ideal is that if you actually did not know the question, that you have an equal chance of choosing any of the given alternatives. And that's a hard thing to do. So basically, increasing the number of alternatives does reduce the effects of guessing. So with 4 alternatives, we have a 25% chance of guessing the right answer. If we only have 3 alternatives, it's a 33% chance. And if we only had 2 alternatives, it's a 50-50 chance. So we do want to have more alternatives to decrease the chance of someone getting an item right by pure chance. However, writing those become difficult. So the reason 4 has been chosen is it gets us to a reasonably decent chance of someone not guessing while still not making it so hard to write alternatives. Because if we're just writing alternatives that are clearly wrong, we're not actually helping our percentage chance of guessing. So for example, if we have 4 alternatives, but 2 of them are clearly wrong. And you'll see these on tests sometimes where a test writer just honestly gets tired or basically is okay with this particular 4 alternatives being more 50-50. A lot of times what you'll see there is, the all of the above or none of the above when clearly one of the answers is most likely correct. That's probably just a false alternative. In that case, it's not really adding to the chance of guessing, as very few people would ever guess that. Or if you see the ridiculous alternative listed. So for example, 3 of the answers are clearly related to the question, which is about the use of a machine, and one of them is George Clooney. That would be clearly just kind of a throwaway, and that means that even at that point, though we have 4 alternatives, the chance of guessing is not 25% anymore, it's closer to 33%, because hopefully no one would say that George Clooney is the answer to how do you use a drill press. So again, we want to think about these things. Also, the other reason to keep it at 4 is that if we increase the number of distractors, 5, 6, or more, not only do they become increasingly difficult to actually create accurate distractors, it also becomes harder for the person to keep all of them in their head. So again, we want to think about cognitive ability and how we basically function when we're looking at alternatives. We found that generally speaking, even if you can create good distractors above 3, so taking it to 5 alternatives, 6 alternatives, not only do you decrease the chance of guessing, you actually start to make the items just innately more difficult for someone to get accurately. So alternatives should be plausible. Again, if our goal is to keep each multiple choice question to have a reasonable chance of being 25% likely to be gotten correct by guessing, we need to make sure that all the alternatives are plausible to someone who doesn't know the right answer. We want to avoid using inclusive alternatives. Balance the number of times they're used as correct or incorrect responses. So again, if we have inclusive alternatives, that is all of the above or none of the above. If you are using these, you want to make sure that they are the correct answer sometimes and are the incorrect answer. A lot of times people fall into the trap where all of the above is always a distractor, in other words, it's never correct, or all of the above is always correct when it pops up. People will notice these trends, and they will start actually, again, it'll change the chance of them actually getting things correct when maybe they don't know the answer. We tend to want to randomly assign the position of the correct responses. Test takers are more likely to choose B and C. So basically, if they're guessing, they tend to go for B and C. A lot of times what happens is if someone isn't randomly assigning the position of the correct responses, we also are more likely as test writers to make it B or C. We'll often write the correct answer somewhere in the middle, then create the distractors. Generally speaking, once you've created any multiple choice test for every item, regardless of where you put the correct answer, randomize the responses for each question. Avoid using similar language in the stem and the correct answer. So again, you want to make sure that you don't have basically tells, if we're talking poker, where someone can actually see that there is specific language in the question and those specific types of verbs or terminology are only in one of the actual alternatives indicating the correct answer. And also avoid asking the meanings of self-descriptive terms. So for example, it's great that some of our terminology is very descriptive, but that also means that if you're describing it and then it's the answer, that's usually going to be a question that everyone should get right, just logically, let alone whether they know it or not. We want to avoid those if possible. If you're actually trying to get at a self-descriptive term, so a term that basically describes itself, then probably you want more of a question that's getting at application. So do they know how to apply that term more than do they know the meaning of that term? Make sure that questions and alternatives do not give away the answer to other questions. So that's another thing is, once you've written all your questions, sometimes those questions may give a little bit of a situational description. They may be describing other components to get to the actual question that you're asking. You want to make sure that you then aren't asking questions that are answered by those questions later in the series of multiple choice items. This is another thing that often will happen as we're writing questions, and we may have to go back and do some alterations or even remove a few items. Make sure the grammatical construction of the stem and all alternatives are consistent. So again, the verb tensive should be the same in all alternatives. The use of articles, a and should be the same and should be grammatically correct. We want to make sure the use of pronouns without appropriate reference in the stems. Use of plurals and singular nouns. Basically, we're wanting to make sure that grammatically all the alternatives are the same. And again, what can happen here is that when we're writing our alternatives, we'll usually write the correct response in line with the verb tensage, the pronouns, the plurals and singular nouns of the actual question. And we may actually make some mistakes as far as verb tensive, pronouns, plural and singular nouns in our alternatives, our distractors. Again, a good test taker is going to pick up on this. And if you've ever heard of the term of a good test taker, and honestly, I probably would be in that category. I know a lot about how tests are written, and you can give me a test. In fact, I've taken some tests in subject matters that I have no knowledge on, and I can usually pull a B or C out of them simply by knowing how tests are written and using these tricks to get to the right answer. So, if we're wanting to make a valid test, we want to make sure that these things aren't happening in our test or the test that we're using. So again, we want to avoid distractors that differ systematically from the correct answer. So, for example, if the correct answer is a long statement, all the distractors should be long statements. If the correct answer is a positive statement, all the distractors should be positive statements. If the correct answer is a qualified statement, in other words, this in this situation, then all of our distractors should be this in this situation. If the correct answer is simple terms, then the distractors should be simple terms. If the correct answer is technical definition, the distractors should be technical definitions. Again, we want to think about this across the board, but ask yourself, what is the correct answer? Define it, and then make sure your distractors are similarly defined. And again, this is another way that people who are good test takers can kind of figure out what the right answer is. If there is one long statement and three short statements, that long statement is probably the right answer. Once you've created your test, or taking a test that you're planning on using in an organization, you want to pilot test it. Sample of test takers similar to the population. You want at least 5 test takers per item. You want to administer under similar test conditions, and you want to do an item analysis. So again, we're wanting to look at item response theory, and what we're looking for is difficulty items ranging from about 0.3 to 0.8. If it's above 0.8, it's going to be a very distinguished item, but very few people are going to get it accurate, which makes us start to wonder, how accurate is it? Likewise, anything below 0.3, almost everyone should be getting, and we're not being able to discriminate. Generally, a good entry-level selection multiple choice test should have an average item rating of about 0.5. In other words, the average people should be getting at least half of the items right. Based on the results of the pilot test, items are selected for the final version. So again, we generally want to start, especially if we're creating our own test, we want a larger pool of items than what we're wanting to end up with, so that we have the ability to remove poor or basically too easy or too hard questions. The other reason we want to look at pilot testing is we want to also make sure that the test is performing correctly. So if we're bringing in a pre-existing test, we want to give this test to people that currently have the job. And we want to make sure, is it related to our criteria, performance? Are our top performers scoring well on the test, or are performers that are poorer scoring worse on that test? Is it actually doing what we want it to do?